I'm not going to read the entire text in Exodus 3 that's been our text for this whole series, but you can take some time and look at it there. The reference will be on the screen. Exodus 3, 4 through 10. This is the story of Moses and the burning bush. And Moses is keeping his father-in-law's sheep and all this kind of stuff, and he sees a bush that's burning, but it's not consumed, and so he goes over to where it's at, and when he gets close, God speaks from the bush to Moses and tells him to take off his shoes, and then he begins to talk with him about some things. The first Sunday that I introduced this series, we talked about intimacy with God, that God wants us in an intimate relationship. He called Moses by name, and I use this example for myself, that God never calls me pastor. He always calls me by name. He doesn't call you whatever your title is. He doesn't call you by that title because that title is a barricade between you and a relationship with God. He calls you by your first name. Now, if you insist on being called by your title, then Dr. Finch is here a few times a month, and he probably needs to have some conversations with you about some insecurities and some issues that you may have that need to be addressed. Nothing wrong with having titles and stuff like that, but if you choose to be called by your title, that's a problem. Because that's a title, that's what you do, that's not who you are, okay? So we talked about that. Paul said, I want to know Christ. And God, I said this, God will not invade where you and I do not invite. We have to open the door for God to come in. God's not going to force his way into our life. He's not going to invade where you and I do not invite. Then we talked about our identity. When he spoke to Moses, he introduced himself this way, I am the God of your father. Meaning, I know your family, Moses. I know your family. This is not an unfamiliar thing to you. I know your family. Then he said, I'm the God of Abraham. Abraham is indicative of God's provision, Jehovah Jireh. He's telling Moses, just that I provided for Abraham, I will provide for you as the deliverer of Israel. I will do the same provision for you that I did there. He said, I'm the God of Isaac. What does Isaac have to do with everything? He's the child of promise. Abraham and Sarah were in their old age, in their 90s. Just think about it. Let that sink in for just a minute. Just think about you're in your 90s and your wife comes home and says, oh, by the way, I'm pregnant. Wow. What do you do with that? But what's even worse, God comes on the scene a little bit earlier before she finds that out, and God comes on the scene and says, you're going to get pregnant. And I'm sure most of you ladies will do the same thing that she did. My husband is an old dude. That ain't going to happen anymore. But it did. But what is Isaac indicative of? God's introducing himself. He's identifying himself. He's saying, look, Isaac was a child of promise. Isaac is a type of the blessings of God coming into our life. Regardless of our age, God is faithful. He will provide and he will bring blessings into our life. And then he said, I'm the God of Jacob, which is very important for Moses because Jacob was a deceiver. That was his name. Moses literally grew up in Pharaoh's household. He killed someone. He's been running from that sin, that offense for 40 years. And God stops him and says, look, I'm the God of Jacob. And what did Moses do? Immediately he knew that Jacob became Israel. So he was telling Moses, it doesn't matter what your past is. The destiny that I have for you can be revealed in your life and can be fulfilled in your life. And so it came across to Moses as an exciting time. Last week I talked with you about interest. What does God do? He shows us what he's interested in. Being interested in what we're supposed to do. Being interested in what God is interested in. Anytime God begins to reveal his destiny to a person, he has to change their interest. Moses was interested in the sheep and taking care of his family. But now God is saying to Moses, look, I have seen the misery of my people. I've seen all these things. And I need you to begin to think more broad than just sheep and your family. And so that's where we left last week. We closed it out with seeking first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. Then all the other things will be added to us as well. Today I want to talk to you about intention. Now there's 5 steps to this. This will be the 4th of the 5. Next week we'll finish it out. But the intention is this. God has said to Moses, I told you what I'm interested in. I've heard the cries of my people. I've seen their misery. That's what I'm interested in. But now I want you to understand what I plan to do about it. What are my intentions? And here's what I'm going to do about all the cries and all the misery. And this is where it brings us to where we are today. Verse 8 of Exodus 3. He said, so I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians to bring them out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. A whole bunch of ites there. But notice the terminology God uses as he begins to speak to Moses. Again, he's speaking, this is a long conversation that's taking place by this burning bush. I have come down to rescue them and to bring them out. After he revealed his interest, then Moses began to see and got to see the needs around him. When Moses' interest began to shift from the sheep to beginning to see, I would venture to say, it doesn't say this, so I'm gonna take a little bit of liberty here this morning. But I can imagine that in Moses' mind's eye, after he hears this, after God speaks to him and tells him, this is what I'm interested in, but here's my intention. Moses began to see and remember in his mind what he saw in Egypt, being a person in Pharaoh's household. The day he killed the Roman taskmaster. He did that because he was abusing some of the Israelites. He saw them in their misery. He saw them, and his mind was brought back to that. Moses began to see the needs that were there in Egypt in the lives of his people. But then God began to share with Moses what he was going to do about it. What does that have to do with you and I today? It has a lot to do with us, because here's what you and I have to get into our mind. We have to know that God works through people. God calls people to carry out his goals. Taking this into consideration too, that in this particular place, when God begins to talk to Moses, that Moses is the only people in the area. He is alone on the backside of the desert. There's nobody there. His family's not there. His father-in-law's not there. It's just Moses and some sheep and whatever critters were in that area of the wilderness. So when he starts talking to Moses about his intentions, Moses is the only person around. So that's kind of a clue that God is about to do something with Moses to ensure the deliverance of his people. It would seem obvious to us reading this story, but see, we're looking thousands of years into the future. We're looking back at what we know happened, and you would think, well, it seems obvious to us that we're in that scenario that Moses would actually see what's coming. Couldn't he understand what's coming? Couldn't he recognize what was happening? It would seem obvious to us what was going to happen next. But here's the other side of this. If you and I have any spiritual sense at all, you can already begin to anticipate where you fit into all this. Where do you fit into God's big plan? Where do you fit into God's destiny for your life? Where do you fit into God reaching the world? Well, this is a story about Moses. No, Moses is the person that's in this story. But in God's grand story, every one of us are in it. And if we know that God uses people to carry out his goals and carry out his missions in life, then where do you fit in? Where do I fit in? One part of what I do is pastor. But that's not all of what the role that I play in the grand scheme of God's destiny. Some of you are embedded saints. Some of you work in the defense industry. You work cleaning houses. You work as a contractor. You're self-employed. You have any number of different jobs in this place. That you think there's my Christian life and then there's my work life. You need to understand this morning that you can't separate it out. God has you where he has you to advance the kingdom in that role. God planted you there. God placed you there to accomplish his will, not your will and not someone else's. That's why you're there. God uses people. Now, when God begins to share his intentions with you, it's a very good indicator that you're going to be involved with those intentions. Now, the question I want to ask you right now in this part of this message is this. How many of you know what God's intentions are for you in your workplace? Don't raise your hand. Just think about it. What are God's intentions for you where you are? In your home, in your neighborhood, in your school, in your workplace, in your circle of friends. You see, you should be able to answer that question. And if you can't answer that question, I hope that in the next few weeks, as you begin to seek this out, that God begins to clarify it for you. Because going through life without clear direction and understanding of what God wants you to do is a miserable existence. You can live a much better life and a much more satisfying life if you know what God wants you to do. And you know what God's intentions for you and where He has you. You see, a lot of us, we spend so much time trying to get out of what we're doing to do something different without taking the time to step back and go, God, you planted me here in this time to accomplish something. Show me what it is. And then embrace that thing. So many times I hear Christians, and they come in and they sit down and talk with some of us, and they'll go, Pastor, I work in a place that's the most ungodly place that you could ever imagine, and I want you to pray that God will bring me to a place where I can work with Christians. And I just sit there dumbfounded. Because if all the Christians leave all the darkness in the world, where's the light going to come from? Where's the light going to come from? If we leave the darkness, if we leave the world and come out of the world and live some monastic lifestyle where we're all Christians, then who's going to share the gospel of Jesus Christ? You see, our role in this life, first and foremost, the role that we have for every believer is that we be a light into the darkness for Jesus Christ, that we shine our light for Jesus to wherever we are. We do that in a multiplicity of ways. We shouldn't be using so many words. It's not about talking so much as it is living. Because if you live Jesus, people know it. They might not know exactly what it is, but at some point in time, they're going to ask you, look, you don't intervene, you don't come in and get involved in the things that we involve ourselves in. You're not involved in the dirty jokes. You're not involved in all this nasty talk around the office. You're different. Why are you different? What's going on with you? There's an open door, and you begin to share it. God has a plan. Once you get to this point, knowing what God intends for you, once you get to this point in the conversation, you're on your way. Once you begin to have these conversations with God, by the time God begins to share His intentions with you, your heart is beginning to beat with a burden for the interest that God reveals to you. In other words, God's interest and God's intentions become ours. That's what He said, whatever your hand finds to do, do everything for what? The glory of God. Do it all for the glory of God. What is it that God intends? What is His intentions for you in your life? Excuse me. All throughout the Bible, you see this principle revealed in the lives of people that God was preparing to fulfill His destiny in. What's God revealing to you today? What's God been speaking to your heart over the last few weeks? Are you at a point where He's begun to show you His intentions regarding an area of need? You see, Moses, the last thing on Moses' mind that day in the wilderness when he was taking care of those sheep was Egypt. When he left there, he wasn't ever thinking about going back because he knew if he went back, he could be killed. He had committed murder. The last thing on his mind, he was busy with taking care of the sheep. He was busy with taking care of his family. He was busy with the day-to-day stuff of life. And in the middle of this day-to-day stuff, God stops him in a way that he couldn't deny something was going on because the bush wouldn't burn up. In reading about that region of the world, because of the type of trees and stuff, there is literally a phenomenon that takes place where these bushes will actually just implode. They just explode in fire. So this wasn't anything different than what he's seen before. What made this different? This bush wouldn't burn up. Walking along, see a bush fire, start the fire. No big deal. I've seen that before. Come back an hour later, the bush is still burning. That's different. 2 hours later, the bush is still burning. Well, and hours later, you say, well, it doesn't say that. It doesn't have to. Think about this. If a bush just catching on fire is a normal phenomenon, what got his attention? He says it. It was not consumed. So a period of time had passed. Moses goes over to where it's at. He stops what he's doing in his routine and goes over to where the bush is. And God begins to speak to him. And as God has this conversation with him over however little amount of time it is, all of a sudden, Moses' intention begins to change. His interest begins to change. And now the thing that God's interested in, Moses is interested in. And he decides to leave the routine and go do what God's called him to do, regardless of what could happen to him. When God begins to show you and I his intentions regarding an area of need, it's because we've stopped long enough to listen to him. We've stopped long enough to begin to see. Moses went back in his mind and he began to remember the pain and the misery that his people were under in Egypt. It's in these times that we need encouragement to follow this very simple principle. Now, when God said, I'm going to do this, Moses could have left the burning bush and took off. But here's the thing I want you to get. Don't jump ahead of God in ambition or anxiety. Don't jump ahead. I mean, I got to do this. I got to do this now. Our ambition is we've got to get this done. We got to go now. We've got to move on our own. But here's the thing. God wasn't finished talking to Moses yet. God wasn't finished. He was just beginning to share his intention and what he planned to do for his people. For a lot of people, and I'm going to speak now about people that want to go into vocational ministry. Because Kim and I came out of college in the early 80s, 1983. We came out of college, and I didn't finish. Kim was a couple of classes away from finishing her degree. We got married a week later, and I told you what our plans were. We were going to be in my dad's business and all this kind of stuff and blah, blah, blah. And then when God began to deal with me about being a youth pastor, this church in Atlanta called us, and I just, that's it, got to be it. So we took off and went to Atlanta. And we spent a year in Atlanta. And the problem with Atlanta was we had great success in Atlanta on one hand. But on the other hand, God wasn't finished speaking to us. And our ambition got ahead of God's plan. And a year later, we had no intention of ever going back into ministry. Our marriage was in a shambles. We didn't think we were going to make it. I left Atlanta, Georgia on a Saturday afternoon after packing up a U-Haul that morning. And I drove to Columbus, Georgia, and I stopped in Columbus, Georgia. Kim and I stopped in Columbus, Georgia to get something to eat. And I stopped there and I ordered a pitcher of beer and drank it. Now some of you are going, well, what's the big deal about a pitcher of beer? Well, back in those days, you just didn't do that. That's back in the day when everything was sin. But I did that to throw down the gauntlet and go, I'm done with this. I'm going back to my old life, where I used to live, because the pain that we endured. See, here's the thing. I should have went back to Lakeland and finished my education. That's what I should have done. But it's very hard as a young person when you want to do something so bad. And God has told you that you're going to be a minister. And that's what you want to do. It's very difficult to step back from that and take some time to go through everything that you need on the front end of preparation so that you don't run into those kind of situations. That doesn't mean that you're not going to have difficulties and things like that. You will. But what happened to Kim, we'd been married a month. We didn't even know each other that well. We've been dating for a year and a half. Oh, well, you knew each other plenty. No. No. You do not know someone until you live with that person. Can I get a witness in the house this morning? Trying to adjust to one another, trying to adjust to a new culture, trying to adjust to a different culture, ministry culture, and a whole bunch of other things. And literally, it was a year that just about destroyed everything we were trying to build in our life. Why? Because we jumped ahead of God in ambition, and we get anxious. Oh, I've got to do this. Here's what I want you to understand. God has a plan and a time for you. Don't get anxious about the time piece. I tell young ministers all the time, get the preparation out of the way. God, the ministry will be there when you get finished preparing. Oh, but if I don't get in it, people are going to die and go to hell. People are going to die and go to hell anyway. You understand what I'm saying? God has a plan for your life. Don't get ahead of God. God hasn't released you yet. He's still talking to you. Keep listening until you get the whole picture. Keep listening until He said everything that He needs, all of His intention for that particular situation, and wait for Him to confirm your involvement by taking you to the next step, the next principle. The last revelation will launch you into a destiny. And here's the thing. There's a very important element that's often overlooked at this point in people's lives, and that is this. When Moses began to hear God's intentions, when God began to share His intentions with him, he had to make a decision. Do I go right now and try to be the deliverer, or do I continue here and keep listening to what God is saying? At any point, Moses could have walked away and quit listening to God. He could have. He could have been anxious. He could have been ambitious and said, I've got enough training. I grew up in Pharaoh's household. I know the tactics. I know how to do this. I need to go now. But God wasn't finished talking. It's many times, it's at this point in time, God is still trying to tell us something. You haven't gotten enough of the picture yet. You don't know what God's going to do. And it doesn't matter if it's about vocational ministry or about a specific need in your life. Don't move until God is finished talking. Many times, this is the place where people lose out on their destiny, right here. They've heard God call them by name. They've heard God tell them, this is the coverage I'm going to give you. I'm going to be faithful to you. I'm going to make sure the blessings of God come into your life. I'm going to make sure that your past doesn't hinder your future. All these things. And we're, yeah. And then God begins to share what He's interested in. And we go, yes, I'm interested in that too. And this is what I'm going to do. Okay, God, I want to get in line with that. Boom. And we run. The problem is God's not finished talking. At that point, God hasn't invited Moses to do anything. He's just talking to him. He's just sharing with him the scenario. So why would people turn from the burning bush of their destiny at this crucial time? I offer these three possibilities. Number one, we lose focus. How do we lose focus? By getting distracted. Peter was walking on water. He crawled out of the boat and was walking on water. And as long as he kept his eyes on Jesus, he was on top of the water. When he took his eyes off Jesus, he sank like a rock. What was the difference? His focus. His focus. You and I have things going on in our life. Look, it's most of the time in our lives, it's not the big things that distract us. It's a ton of little things. It's a ton of little things. I got this kid I got to take over there. I got this kid I got to take over there. I got to get this kid I got to take over there. And then I've got to be here with my husband. I got to be here with my work. I got to do this. I got to do that. And it's all the little things that just begin to swirl around us, and we get in this vortex, and we don't know what's going on. Until one day we're sitting here, we're going, why did I stop pursuing my destiny? Why did I lose my motivation? What changed in those few weeks of time? What was my focus? Because we realize that we've allowed ourselves to become so occupied with other things that ultimately changed our motivation. It's a continual challenge in every person's life. But it's an extremely critical one when we begin to search for our destiny in God. And what you and I need to recognize this morning is this, that distractions are a tool of the enemy. It's a tool of the enemy. He wants to distract us. He wants to get our minds and our eyes off of what's important. He wants to get us looking at things that don't amount to anything in the scope, but they seem huge in our life because we want to do this, and we have this goal, we have this ambition, and we want to do all this kind of stuff, and we want to make sure our children have everything that they have. All this kind of stuff is wonderful. Or I've got to be in ministry. If I don't get in ministry tomorrow, then people are going to be lost and go to hell and all this kind of stuff. And the truth of the matter is, God's not finished talking. But even in our own life, we need to begin to ask the right question. Because the question that we always ask is this, can I do this? Can I do this? And that's not the right question. The question is, should I do this? We ask this question, these questions are put before us every day at Generations United. People come, well, Pastor, this would be a great idea. Pastor Craig, this would be a great, Pastor Terry, this would be a great idea. Pastor Andy, Pastor JT, this would be a great idea. There's a whole bunch of great ideas out there, and we can do a lot of things. But that's not the right question. The right question is, should we do it? In your family, quit asking, can we? And begin to ask, should we? In your relationships, quit asking, can I be in a relationship with this person? And start asking, should I be in a relationship with this person? In my job, can I do this job? Maybe, but should you? Can we is not the right question. Should we is the right question. The second thing we do is we lose hearing. We lose hearing. We lose hearing not because our hearing goes away necessarily, like mine has in my left ear, but we lose hearing because we listen to too many other things. How many of you are old enough to remember party line telephones? Oh, wow. Wow. I remember my grandmother had one of those when I was a kid. I thought it was the coolest thing to go over and pick up that phone and hear somebody talking on the other side of it when nobody called the house. And then I'd get in trouble. Put that phone down. Now, for those of you that have never had the pleasure of a party line, here's how, let me just enlighten you just a little bit. There was only one line with one phone number, which was shared by up to about eight families. Can you imagine that? Whew. And they're in multiple homes. They don't live under the same, they're in multiple homes. Each family or home had their own distinctive ring. Maybe your ring was one long and two short. My grandmother's ring, I remember, was 3 long rings. And when you heard your ring, you answered the phone. If it was not your ring, then you were supposed to leave it alone. Now, I know a lot of people didn't, but you're supposed to. If you picked up the phone to make a phone call and somebody was using the party line, then you just put the phone down until they got finished. But here's the thing. Can you imagine today 8 families, all with teenage daughters? Can you imagine that? I mean, that's just unbelievable. Trying to, the 8 teenage daughters trying to get on the phone at the same time, and you didn't have cell phones and all that kind of stuff. What a nightmare it would be. It would be mass confusion. But the same is true many times when God is speaking to us, when we begin to listen to too many other voices. See, I have a lot of hearing loss in my left ear because when I was young, I've always had a lot of guns around, shot a lot of guns and things like that. But when I was a little young boy, and I started shooting high-powered rifles when I was about 10 years old. Started hunting with my dad when I was about 6, carrying a gun. I couldn't carry a bullet, but I got to carry a gun, which was a big deal. At some point during the day, my dad would stop and he would give me the bullet out of his, it's kind of like Barney Fife got one bullet, But I shot a lot of guns when I was a kid, and I didn't use hearing protection because you just didn't think about that in those days. Well, now I've got about, 60, 80% of hearing loss in my left ear. And matter of fact, when I was in high school, when I had a hearing test, the person came out and said, "You hunt, don't you?" And I went, "Yes, I do." She said, "You need to wear hearing protection." Because I don't hear, and as long as it's quiet and there's no other ambient noise around, I'm cool. It's no problem. But I go into a restaurant where a lot of people talking and stuff like that, especially where there's a tile floor or a wood floor. I have to sit at a certain point in the table with my right ear to everybody, or I'm just out of the conversation. I'm just out of it. I'm out of it most of the time anyway, but you understand what I'm saying. I have hearing loss, but the more noise that's around me, the worse it is. I can still go deer hunting in the woods and be sitting in a tree stand early in the morning or late in the afternoon, and a deer walking through the woods, and I can hear a deer walking on the pine needles because there's no other noise around. It's quiet. Hear a twig snap. Heart starts racing, all that stuff. That has nothing to do with the message. I'm just telling you the story. I'm supposed to be quit right now anyway. The problem is this, that when there's a lot of noise, I can't delineate. I can't pull it out. And there are a lot of people that, there is wisdom in a multitude of counsel. There is. However, there's also confusion in a multitude of opinions. And we've got to be able to separate the difference between opinions and counsel. The third reason that we stop short of our destiny many times is because we lose interest. And we lose interest because things move too slow. It's especially true in this country. It's especially true in this country. We're so busy. We're moving at an incredibly fast pace. And if you're in a larger city, it's even faster. But it's nonetheless true even in a little town called Niceville. There's a lot of stuff that goes on. A lot of stuff. I was thinking about this morning as I was going back over these notes and just kind of thinking over my last 2 or 3 days for me personally. And I'm not bleeding on anybody. This is what I do, and it's cool. But I got home Wednesday night about 8:30. I got a phone call about 9 o'clock, and I didn't get home till a little after midnight. And then on Thursday, I'd let the office be off on Thursday, thinking everybody had the one last hurrah getting ready for school to start, and everybody needs some extra, time and all this kind of stuff. But I spent the whole day, one crisis after another, with people in the church. Same thing again on Friday. Something like this is going on and going on and going on and going on. All this kind of stuff. So busy that I remembered the men's breakfast at 8 o'clock last night. So those of you guys that were wondering where the pastor was at yesterday morning, I forgot you. But see, it's not just me. It's all of us. I'm no more busy than anybody else. We all have a lot of stuff going on and a lot of things that are vying for our attention. Young people, you start getting out of high school and out of college, and you want to have everything that your parents had, but you can't understand that your parents have gotten that stuff over 25 to 30 years. And they've had to work hard for it. So many kids get involved in, they get credit cards and everything else, and so they buy all these accumulations, and they spend the rest of their life digging out of debt. Failing to realize that it takes a lifetime to accumulate that stuff. You see, we want God to reveal His destiny for us as if He was a search engine. Why can't I just Google God and I get what I need? You see, we are a product of our own vices. And we're a product of our own convenience. And we want the destiny of God to be revealed in our life with the ease that we can Google and research something out. And it just doesn't happen that way. You remember when you were a kid on the playground, you would always play this game called Simon Says. One person would be Simon, the rest would line up in front of Simon and respond accordingly to the commands. The key was to pay close attention to the terminology. If the person that was Simon, if he says, Simon says, do this, you did it. But at some point, Simon was not going to say, Simon says, he was just going to say, pull on your ear. And if he didn't say Simon says, then you were out of the game. The obvious key to winning the game called Simon Says was to listen intently to what was being said. The same is true when God is speaking to us about His destiny, about our destiny. Listen carefully until He's finished speaking. You see, guys, it's real easy to run ahead of God. It's real easy to get out there because we're ambitious, because we want to do it. It's real easy to get in too big of a hurry. It's real easy to lose our focus because of the distractions that are in our life. It's real easy to have our hearing all messed up because of the multiplicity of voices and things that are pulling at us all the time. But when it really boils right down to it, it's simply this. God is speaking. He will talk. He will guide. He will reveal if we will listen. Amen? Let's stand all over this room this morning. Let's do It Is Well. While in the car I was singing this song earlier this morning, it was just kind of soaking in through it all. Through it all. My eyes are on you, my hope is on you. That's kind of how I want to close this service today. I'm not gonna pull you down to the altar this morning if you haven't been listening to God or if you've gotten distracted or anything like that, because I don't think that's the kind of service this is. But I will ask the altar team to come and just kind of stand off to the side here. And if you have a need in your life and you want to come, then you just come. But at our closing song this morning, let's sing this song together. And let's sing it in a way because it is well with our soul. And if we just listen, God will speak. He will reveal. Amen? Amen. Let's sing it together.